Well, we do have Jennifer Komar-Olivarez with us here from the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and I want to start just by asking you to tell us what you do at the MIA.
Well, for those of you who may not know me, I am a curator in the Decorative Arts, Textiles, and Sculpture department. So we have a very wide range of works of art under our department, and it includes everything from medieval sculpture to things that were made last year. So and textiles as well, Western textiles. So I am responsible for the areas mainly 20th and 21st century craft, design, and architecture, including the Purcell Cuts House, which some of you may be familiar with. And so I program our craft galleries.
Okay. So you use the term, and I know it's in your job title, decorative arts. What does that term mean?
What does that mean? I had a colleague who used to say we were the Department of Pots and Pans, which it keeps us all humble. But I think that people relate to our department because, and I think this is kind of crucial to the discussion of craft, in that decorative arts have a either genetically or inherently some kind of relationship to function.
Okay.
So even if it's a presentation cup for a royal family, it still has a basis in function.
Okay. So for you,
the things you use, is
the term craft and the term decorative arts, are those synonyms?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Not necessarily.
All right, okay.
Not necessarily. It's a subset.
Okay. Oh, interesting. All right. Well, we're going to talk about this current exhibition that's going on now at the MIA, which you have titled, I'm presuming, Craft in the Hand, From Visible to Integral. Tell me how that title and subtitle came to be, and what they mean.
Well, really, the idea for me was there's so many aspects to contemporary craft right now that can be discussed, and this was a sort of boiling down of that, to think about what is the hand's relationship to craft, and what is the changing relationship of the hand in craft at this point in time, or mostly over the last 10 or 15 years. But, the show has objects that extend further than that. So I guess visible, it's kind of two ends of the spectrum in a way. And as we look through the slides, you'll see that. The visible part can even mean like the mark of the maker. What is leaving the mark of the maker all about? Integral could be essentially like the skill that is required to make something that isn't necessarily an end in itself, but leads you, that is a very important part of the object, but could be a jumping off point, or a means to an end.
Okay. So we're going to go through a number of slides that represent pieces that are in the show, and we'll leave time at the end for your questions. And I want to just remind you that when you and I first started talking a couple weeks sort of intensively about what this show was, and you walked me through and so on and so forth, you said you wanted to do this show because you wanted to show where craft has been and where it is going, which for me begs kind of a possibly annoying question, which is, what is craft to you? And we could spend the whole evening on that, and we don't want to do that, believe me. But just very briefly.
It is hard for me to. I'm not necessarily going to give a definition of what craft is, but I think that it is. It's something that, again, for me, has a basis in function and has a strong relationship to the handmade. I think. And I think this is what draws me as we discuss this further. This has kind of come out in our own discussions about this, that these aspects are changing. There's a lot of craft that has nothing to do with function anymore. But the fact that it has this genetic heritage, I keep coming back to that, is why we have it in our department as opposed to contemporary art. Just kind of typologically speaking, you could argue it in many different ways, but I see it as coming from this like modern functional handmade object that, of course has its roots in the arts and crafts movement, and even further back if you want to go that far, like where do you start? But I think when you think about modern craft and the modern craft movement kind of from the 30s onward, it really does have a lot to do with function, although we're moving out of that, certainly in many cases.
Okay. So when I tell people I'm the editor of a magazine about artists that's called American Craft, they almost always say, hey, what's the difference between art and craft? And I think you've said craft really comes from function and art comes from something else, which we won't get into.
Right. I think, that's fraught with, arguments.
Okay,
but
great.
No, but I think I still think that is a very that's where I go back to.
Okay, great. All right. So let's start with some of the first pieces that you see in the show. And we'll go through some of these kind of quickly. First thing you see when you go to the show is a bunch of these turned wood pieces that are just amazing in their sort of refinement and perfection. They're just very polished and lovely. Something like this. Prestini. Talk a little bit about how this showed up at the Walker in the 40s.
Yeah, these pieces come kind of from the Prestini school of wood turning and design. James Prestini was one of the earliest members of the modern wood turning movement, and it has been argued that he wasn't really a craftsperson, that he was a designer, but he made his own things. He designed them and then he made them. But he made them to be extremely precise, very symmetrical. You can see even the graining on this plate, which isn't that big. It's about, dinner plate size. That he was really looking for regularity, but yet he was employing hand processes to make these. But this kind of interesting juxtaposition made him very attractive to places like MoMA, where Edgar Kaufman Jr. purchased his work for the collection, and also the Walker Art Center, which carried his pieces in their everyday art gallery in the post-war period. And this particular plate was given to us in the 1990s by a woman who had gotten it as a wedding present. She was from Minneapolis. And then we subsequently did some research, or I had been doing some research in the Walker Everyday Art Quarterlies, and found that they were selling James Prestini plates for like $11. So, in the 1950s. So very likely this could have been bought at the Walker shop. And so there is this kind of crossover, but it was shown with things like, Eames furniture, Harry Bertoia furniture, that sort of thing. So there is an interesting context. Anyway, Prestini's school really was carried on by people like Bob Stocksdale and Bert Marsh with this kind of perfection of form and incredible skill and technique with the lathe, and then the finishes that came from that. And also, you have to think about, too, the selection of the wood pieces that they were turning. So this is really, I think, how the modern craftsman, when you think of like the Bauhaus, that kind of modern aesthetic was carried out in the early wood turning. Some kind of later pieces with that similar aesthetic. This Paul Fennell, these are sort of in scale. The Ray Keeble, and again, they're all from the same school. If you think about it that way, followers of Stocksdale and Prestini, but this Fennell piece is, just a few inches tall. So he had the ability to create these wonderful classic vase forms in miniature as well as in larger scale.
So when I look at this, what I see is a real loving devotion to craft, a development of skill that's pretty extraordinary, and a real striving for perfection. And now, something completely different. Another grouping in the show has to do with imperfection. So it's in some ways opposed to what we've just seen. Very much a different sensibility, very much about the mark of the hand, and has origins in the Japanese tea ceremony. This is a potter, Minnesota potter, many of us here are probably familiar with, Warren McKenzie. how did a guy from Minnesota come to be influenced by the Japanese tea ceremony?
Well, I think there's a couple different things going on with this group, and one of them is Warren Mackenzie's kind of his appreciation of folk craft that he really gained through working with Bernard Leach at St. Ives in England. And, you know, that tradition was about making, handmade objects that became part of your everyday life, that were used every single day. And so, you know, there's a certain imperfection. There isn't necessarily a striving for perfection. I think there's a skill in creating form. And if you watch Warren throw a pot, even today, he makes it look incredibly easy because, you know, again, it's just the skill from the repetition. But there is an allowing for serendipity with decoration, and we'll see. I think we have a couple of slides coming up. If you switch to,
yeah. No, it's kind of hard to see here. I love this because this is like literally the mark of the hand.
So this is, and these are my pictures. These here in the gallery. So I apologize for the quality, but this plate has the mark where, you know, he dipped the plate into the glaze, and you can see where his fingers rested up at the top. And, you know, so this, in a way, it's like the mark of the hand, and you then can connect with the person who made, you know, you have an immediate connection with the person who made it. But again, like I said, these pieces were made to be used. And it's interesting because if you talk to Warren today, the fact that he has objects in museums is a little bit strange and disturbing for him because he knows they'll never be used again. We don't eat off our plates. We don't sit on our furniture.
Well, now, so I'm thinking as I look at this is the kind of, you know, mark that those wood turners we looked at a minute ago would find completely objectionable.
Right.
They
would
didn't
have
want this.
Eliminated it, or if it had been on wood, they would have sanded it out.
Right. Okay.
I think you have another piece by Warren too.
Right. The rim on this is sort of stunning. It's so crisp.
This is a larger platter. It's quite stunning, and I just like it because it shows again the kind of a serendipitous nature to the decoration, but yet you can tell he has control over the slip. Very, very nice piece that we got from a collection. And a number of these pieces came from a collection of from a man who collected Japanese tea ceremony ceramics, but then there were other pieces that related to those that were made by American potters. And this piece came with that group. And there's some others coming up too. This is one of those as well.
Okay, so where do we see the mark of the hand here?
Well, you know, I like this piece. And, you know, we got these in 2007. They hadn't been put out. And I thought this would be a really good opportunity to show these because you're seeing the pinching of the handle as it's attached to the body of the pot, and you do see, you know, imperfections. There's not necessarily like the lid. There's not a desire to make it perfect, and this relates to the tea ceremony in that imperfections are valued. And John Dix is one of those ceramic artists that not necessarily filtered through St. Ives the way Warren Mackenzie's experiences with Japanese art were, you know, in large part, but actually going to Japan and studying with the Japanese ceramic artists. And so, you know, you almost see these a little bit closer to that source with the tea ceremony pieces that we have by the Western artists. And it's really about, you know, imperfections allow you to have a different sensory experience maybe than you would with something that's completely regular, that you remember that this is handmade. Whereas if you were holding something that were made at a factory, like a factory plate or a teapot that was mass produced, you wouldn't expect to have any kind of those imperfections. They sort of remind you that it was handmade.
Okay.
As part of the whole sensory experience of the tea ceremony. I think we have a couple other pieces coming up too.
Okay. This one I loved, and frankly, this picture doesn't do it justice. This is just gorgeous.
And this reminded you of your own ceramic experiences, yes?
Well, no, we're getting to that
one.
to that
one. Oh, this one reminded you of it. Okay. The broken and repaired?
Yeah. Now, years ago, I used to do ceramics. And for me, I had this, like, you know, intense job. where I had to control things, and I like to control things anyway. And then I would go to the pottery studio at night, and it was such a lesson to me that doing pottery was all about letting go of control. You know, you could work on something for a couple of hours and perfect it, and one false move, you'd wreck it, or at least I'd wreck it. And or maybe you'd get it just right, and it would harden, and you'd put it in the kiln, and the glazing, it would fire strangely, or it would break in the kiln, or whatever, and you'd be very disappointed. And so, you know, for me, this was actually sort of Zen-like, and it was good for me to learn to focus on the process. But I looked at this, and when you and I talked about this, you used the phrase, celebrate the mend, and talk a little bit about how this broken pot was mended.
Well, this is a loan piece from the Roots. If any of you know them, they have a great ceramics collection. All cultures, you know, well, many cultures represented, but they were drawn to this piece, and then I was drawn to this piece as they explained it, because it just was one of those things where, you know, the piece broke into pieces, but rather than discarding it, they repaired it with, I don't know if I think it's a metal, like a platinum, type of repair, to really draw attention to it. In my mind, it reminds me of like the old ceramic repairs that you find on some of our collection where they staple. They used to use staples. This was in the olden days, but you still see that. But it's like, it was too valuable to throw away. You would never put it in the garbage, but you could put this huge metal staple in it, you know. But this is a little bit more elegantly done, but there's no disguising it. It's not like a conservation job. It's not like you would take it to Midwest Art Conservation where they like erase any trace of breakage. It was really about the opposite, about it's okay, you know, this is still useful, and accidents happen, and you're right. I think it is literally a very Zen-like thing.
Right. Like, I need to go and spend a couple years there, and that would be like really good for my character. Okay. This is one of those pieces, you know, you totally see imperfection here, right? But I can see a real humble beauty in this. But my question to you as a curator is, how do you know what is deliberate artistic imperfection and what is undeveloped skill?
Well, that's a very good question. But in this particular case, you know, just within the context that this was made, it was made by somebody who really had a strong understanding of ceramics, and in this case also wood firing. But what surprised me about this, and it came in a box, like some of these artists even boxed them like the Japanese ceramics, so they're not just sitting on a shelf in our storage area. And we pulled it out of the box, and I'd seen like a picture of it on the box top. When I pulled it out, I was surprised at how incredibly light it was and how much aggregate it has in it. And just look at the rim. It's almost like you wouldn't want to drink out of it. It would cut you, you know. It's just so full of sand, and it was really, really, light in the hand. And it just struck me as kind of a successful irregularity. You know, it just, his interpretation just really, I don't know, it just struck with me. And I guess that is also part of personal preference too, which we'll talk about more.
Which we'll get to, yeah. Okay. Now, we're going to end this little grouping with this piece, which I thought was funny because all of these pieces are in the functional tradition, very much about use and daily life and all that kind of stuff. But look at those, you know, kooky little handles. I mean, they are like these little vestigial things. And why do you think, why did he use these little completely impractical jug handles?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that because I don't know the artist personally, but I think it might have been a reference to like a Western form also, even though his primary inspiration was Japanese ceramics. But yeah, it's almost like a 19th century functional object, like a Appalachian ceramics.
Okay. So now we're going to look at some other pieces in the show where we're looking at woodworkers, but we're looking at woodworkers who aren't so crazy about perfection or who want to move a little bit beyond perfection. And what I saw, you know, from my experience of the show, were maybe wood artists who, like the ceramic artists we've talked about, want to let things take their course a little bit, want to let go of control a little bit, whether it's in the artistic process, whether it's in nature. Is that an accurate reading of this?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think definitely speaking, like letting go of control, I think in working with wood, there is an inherent aspect of that, in that you never know what's inside. It could be a big hole. It could be, you know, it could fly, just literally fly apart. And so people like Todd Hoyer have kind of used this as, you're starting to see this as a bit of a means of expression. So, you know, for him, there's two pieces in the show, but this exploration of eliminate, like how much can you eliminate when you're working with wood? It's a reductive process. It's not like working with ceramics where it's more of an additive process. You're creating a form. He created a form by turning it, and then he burned it away, you know, and also it left, like, there's bark inclusions around there. So, you know, the piece itself was not stripped of the bark to begin with. So then when you start burning it away, it's like, it becomes kind of a reference to a vessel, but it's obviously not functional. And Todd Hoyer had a lot of emotional, kind of personal things going on when he was doing this type of experimentation. So it becomes kind of, you know, the destructive process was sort of connected to his emotions at that time. But it's a way of using, I don't think it was like exploding the whole canon of Bob Stocksdale, but it was like, how can we use different tools and different specimens of wood to take this in a different direction, a more personal direction?
Okay. Which sort of foreshadows stuff that we're going to see here in a minute. Here's another piece, which was, you know, very much innovative in sort of the processes used. Can you talk about those processes?
And we talked about like lack of control too. And Michael Peterson is, he started out turning pieces. He mainly works with madrone burl, which is from the Pacific Northwest. So it's like a local wood for him. And you can see these really kind of wild and crazy graining patterns that you get with that burl. But he works primarily now with a chainsaw to rough out the forms, but he works with green wood. So those artists that work with greenwood always know, just like you with the ceramics, it's like once you know, there's a certain aspect that you can't control. And with the greenwood, they know that there's going to be some kind of warping and drying, perhaps moving and cracking out of square. And that's really part of the process. But you get to a point where it's like you do certain, you know, things to the piece, but then you can't control all of them. So there is a definite lack of control. Although this piece, although it looks like it might be driftwood or something you would find on the side of the beach, it's very, very heavily processed. Like, you know, in addition to the plunge cuts with the wood to hollow it out, it's actually three pieces that are, one's inside the top one, and then you have this bottom piece. He, you know, sands it, pigments it, you know, all these different processes to sort of get it to look like something you'd find, you know, just laying out in nature. So I really like that about this piece.
Okay. So a lot of these things that we've talked about, I mean, with these last two pieces, it's about mimicking nature. But here's something that's very different, because here is an artist who sort of slathers the inside of this piece with pigment. And to me, this seems like a whole nother level of like woodworking subversion.
Well, it was. You know, when you think about the canon being the perfect form and Bob Stocksdale, when people like Stephen Hogbin and we have Giles Gilson, I think, coming up, when they started to paint the forms, it was like, why would you obscure the surface of the wood? Why are you adding this other technique? What is this for? Why are you doing this? And they're sort of like, because we can. I mean, you know, they were just kind of, why not? It's a new direction. Fields evolve, and it becomes less about function, like why, you know, you would never eat out of a bowl that has pigment in it, or that's sort of, you know, kind of angled to one side with the opening. So this is, I think, where you're starting to move into less function and more art object.
Right. And I wonder if this, you know, if this sort of concern about how we ought to do things is more acute in wood than in other media. And I don't know why I say that exactly. I mean, I took a woodworking class a few years ago. We made a footstool. At the end, everybody was talking, I'm going to put oil on mine. I'm going to stain mine. I said, I'm going to paint mine fuchsia. And people did sort of look at me like, why in the hell did you take a woodworking class? I mean, woodworking is about wood, right? You're supposed to see the wood. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, I don't really like brown. So, it feels to me like because wood comes from trees, it's like really messing with nature if you put color on it, right? I mean, it's like we want to see the treeness of it.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. But, just in your defense, I mean, I have no problems with painted wood, but I think you still get different tactile qualities with wood, even painted. Yes. You don't get the visual quality, but you get other tactile qualities with wood, as opposed to some other material like metal.
True. Now here's a really rude wood artist.
So Giles Gilson was an industrial designer, a designer who is familiar with automotive paints, and so he was kind of coming from the outside, a bit of an iconoclast. And I guess you had said, is this more typical in wood than other fields? Maybe not. I mean, Maren would say one thing about ceramics and there's different fields, but I think with wood, it's kind of a more compressed timeline. So as far as like where the experimentation has happened, and so everybody knows everybody and they follow everybody, and there's a lot of kind of watching what's going on, and the developments have come more recently in more recent history. And so I think there's maybe less of a sense of, wanton experimentation, but people like Giles Gilson, not sort of being an insider by any means, was compelled to kind of create these canvas. This is where you start to think about it maybe as a canvas,
right,
or a sculpture.
Right. It's this sort of goblet form that he really messes with.
But he has these openings too, so
right.
It's kind of like a Georgia O'Keeffe.
Now here's, it's hard to see in this light, but here's a piece, a wood piece that has been sort of messed with. It's been dyed and the surface has been carved. But to me, this looks far more orthodox. And I'm thinking that's because of the regularity of the pattern. Do you think that's how it has that effect? Yeah,
I mean, I think that's true. And Mark Gardner, Mark and Stoney Lamar shared a studio for a long time. I don't know if they still do, but
Lamar, big
who's on the board here and in Asheville. And so Mark's a younger artist, so he's kind of watched these developments, and I think there's maybe less fear with the younger generation, but he's, there's a long tradition of ebonized wood, and this is kind of in that tradition. Right. What he's done is incise it. In a way, it's interesting, because I was working with my intern when we were interpreting these pieces, and she was writing about this piece that it looked like it was a vessel in a container, almost like it had a sort of textile or leather or some kind of embossed holder. So in a way, it's almost like a trompe l'oeil kind of effect that he has, but it is still very regular in form. He's not messing with the form. He's not cutting it apart and putting it back together.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of conservative in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we go to some wood guys who really break the mold. Here's Mark Lindquist, who is a real kind of rabble-rouser. Tell us a little bit about why he's been important among woodworkers.
Well, Mark, his father was a wood-turning artist, and he worked with irregular pieces of wood and celebrated those and left the edges, you would see like burl edges, and they would be misshapen, and they would be thick, and so he kind of grew up with that tradition as a woodworker himself. And in the late 70s, he decided to really work on a larger scale and start doing more sculptural things. And he is actually really important for the field in that he started interpreting his works as sculpture. He started showing them on pedestals, and he was the first to do that. And so he was really important to kind of having thought about wood in one way to start really thinking about it in yet another way. And so we have, I don't know if you want to switch the slide or not, but this piece, that piece was made with the use of robotics. Oh, wait, go back.
Okay.
So the piece, this isn't the making of that piece, but you can see these kind of, again, it's like the plunge cuts made with a chainsaw. Okay, now go ahead and switch to the next slide. So I think this is really a kind of hilarious photo. This was in the AAW's publication last year, so they pulled it from their archives, but it's David Ellsworth, who is one of the kind of really important people in the wood turning field, and has disseminated his own information and information about tools, and has been kind of a spokesperson for the movement.
A legend, really.
A legend.
Yeah.
Stoney Lamar, who's on the ACC board, he's a great guy. He's standing in the back. They're both looking at Mark Lindquist, who has this lathe rigged up with a robotic arm and the chainsaw. And so he's showing them this technique, which he actually developed in response to an injury that he had where he couldn't have control over his tools at the lathe. So he thought, well, I'm going to develop robotics to do this carving. And he has continued to develop robotics to make the piece that you saw in the previous slide, which has come later. This piece here in the Waterbury's collection. It's in the show. And I just love the look on David Ellsworth and Stoney's faces, because they're just looking at him with this intense suspicion. It's like, you're doing what?
And the caption says they confront him.
This was from their book. They confront him, like he's really having to defend himself. And so it's one of those moments where it's once removed. I mean, a lot, and there are people who say that wood art that's made on a lathe is not made by hand. But I would argue that even if you're not touching the wood with your hand, you're touching it with a tool, with a gouge or whatever, there's still so much that happens to that piece of wood before it's finished that, it's a handcrafted piece. It's a unique object. So I don't really subscribe to that. But this is really, again, it's like once removed. He's using machines to do some of this work that ends up being called a handcrafted object. But and we have, even kind of coming up later, we have some different examples of that. No safety goggles. I don't see safety goggles on anybody.
No. You see a lot of facial hair, but no safety goggles.
Yeah, that's not going to help.
Okay. Here's another big chainsaw user. Here's Jack Slentz using a blowtorch, of all things. It's like you're going to burn the wood.
Exactly. So Jack really comes, more from a sculptural background and is a sculpture instructor. And he likes to call his pieces he likes to say they have a from hell to hell and back quality. So he burns the wood, he tortures it, he allows it to split like this. It becomes part of the overall design. These are meant to be kind of anthropomorphic, that they are individuals and that we are all individuals. No two are alike. And, as a tool for him, he has no problem burning the surface of the wood and obscuring it for sculptural effect. In essence, that has become an accepted tool. But he was one of the first to use that tool. And you can see this. Although these are very carefully planned and made, there's an unfinished quality to the pieces. You see a lot of splinters and things. Bob Stockstill would have sanded those off.
He would have had a heart
Well,
attack.
he would have had a heart attack.
So one thing I learned from this, and this was something that really kind of clarified things for me as an editor, was, I reacted to these as anthropomorphic and as, pieces that had sort of a presence. And I thought, this appeals to me. And here's another piece from the show that appealed to me in that same way. This doesn't really do it justice. When you see this in the show, these like crumpled coffee cups are like 18 inches high. Mm-hmm. You look at it and you go, yeah, sometimes I need that much coffee. But they have like a personality. You can imagine them being alive, And you referred to these, Jennifer, as animated. And I thought, I think some people like animated stuff. And for me, these coffee cups, just like Jack Slentz's work, really bring that to home. One thing we have talked about in the magazine, this is kind of goofy, but We have this great copy editor who says, sometime we should have a cute themed issue where everything in the issue is like cute. And I think, that's kind of what she's talking about. Everything should be like animated. You can imagine it being anthropomorphized. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to move into sort of another grouping and another sensibility. And the important guy here is second from right, and that's Peter Volkos, a major guy in ceramics, who, when this picture was taken, was very much in the functional tradition, very much making vessels. But he ended up, and this is a piece that's in the show, as a major sculptural figure, a major guy who brought in sculpture to ceramics. Talk about this piece a little bit and how it ties into the show.
Peter Volkos, if you're not familiar with him, probably a lot of you are, but he, at the Archie Bray Foundation in Montana, was making kind of production pottery. I mean, he was making kind of what they were selling there in quantity, and so he threw pot after pot after pot, and then it just became like almost automatic for him. His skill in doing that increased so much that it became like a jumping off point. He needed to do more. Anyway, long story short, he became really one of the first to make large scale sculptures in clay. And if you look at this piece, it is open on the top. It's kind of hard in the exhibition to see unless you're really tall and looking over. But with these sculptures that he was making in the late 50s, he kind of threw pieces that formed a core, and then he attached these sections to them, kind of cantilevering off. Now, this piece, we have two pieces in our collection. This piece was given to us. It was in a private collection and came kind of out of nowhere in New York City. So we don't know what title it has. It probably did have one. But he's really working more in a abstract form. He's erasing the marks of his hand, and so everything is kind of smoothed out. These are kind of wedge-shaped forms, and it's outlined. I can't tell if you can tell it from here, but it's outlined in blue glaze, which he used at that time. Now, I think, is the next slide the other piece that we had, the Sevillanas? So he was also, at the same time, making pieces like Sevillanas, which is in our collection, and this piece is, again, it's like appended, all the pieces are appended onto a central core, but he clawed his way through the clay, which of course is what he became better known for later in his career. And that's really the direction that he ended up going, where you see the mark of his hand in the clay, even in the sculptures. It isn't like functional pottery like Warren's where you see his fingerprints, but it's really about leaving those marks behind. And he had very powerful hands and was very strong. And so it's really interesting to kind of see at that moment of experimentation, because he was making these sculptures at the same time. And this one went to MoMA for an exhibition that mostly was largely ignored by the New York community, but later have become really important pieces in his career, because at that moment he was trying to define what sculpture could be in ceramics.
What I find interesting about these pieces is that around this time, he had been the head of ceramics at what's now the Otis School of Art in Los Angeles, and had really kind of built that department. He got fired for making these kinds of pieces. Why was that considered so dangerous?
Well, I think it was also based on his attitude at the school too. But
he was chronically late.
He lived large, and he did things very unorthodox in an unorthodox fashion. And he was also a flamenco guitar player too, which is why the Sevillanas is reference to a flamenco guitar player. But I think he was considered to be an enfant terrible. Yeah, exactly, kind of a loose cannon. So, but then, of course, as you know, has a great legacy with many students.
Right. Okay. So I think, one of the things that strikes me that we're seeing here is that we're seeing sort of a parallel to those traditional woodworkers who didn't like the chainsaw users. Now you're seeing, traditional ceramists who don't like this abstract expressionism. We found in our archives, our magazine archives, a 1961 story on the new ceramic presence, which was all about this abstract expressionism, sculptural ceramics, very much featuring the work of Volkos. And after this was the story was published, there was a letter to the editor by a young potter by the name of Warren Mackenzie, who wrote in and made fun of a piece that had been photographed and appeared with the story called The Big Pile, and compared the new ceramics to cow dung. So, you find the sort of traditionalists and the innovators fighting in all sorts of different mediums.
I'm glad you included that, because I think it's just really kind of a snapshot of what the attitude was at that time. And what do you see? What did you came up with a quote about acceptance and?
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about, like innovation. In innovation, people always quote Schopenhauer, who said, every great new idea is ridiculed, then it is met with violent opposition, then it's accepted as self-evident. And I think you sort of see that in art. It's like, chainsaws, that's crazy. Chainsaws, that's terrible. Chainsaws, why not? So,
exactly.
Okay. The next grouping, I have to say, I don't understand very well. So I'm hoping you can kind of enlighten us a little bit. You had said that you think this group sort of reflects the absence of the mark of the hand. And so what we're going to see here is not really perfection, it's not really refinement, and it's not really imperfection and that sort of boisterousness or animation. It's something kind of different. So talk a little bit about these pieces.
Well, this is a group that, and like you said, that our kind of thematic panels say the absence of the hand, but I guess what I really did mean was the absence of the mark of the hand, because these are pieces that, they're kind of by wildly different artists that aren't necessarily associated with each other, but they formed a group. And just to preface it too, that, when we come up with exhibitions like this, we're thinking about, well, what from our collection really helps to illustrate a different idea? Or frankly, like if you have a group, maybe what does that group illustrate? And so for me, these sort of fell together. They were pieces that weren't on view, hadn't been shown for a long time. And in fact, this William Wyman, which we got I think we got it in the early 80s, pretty small. And it was just like, this is actually quite nice, and it relates very well to our false door from our Egyptian collection. And so we love to be able to tell stories about those reference points, and this artist had also that reference point as well, looking at architecture of the ancient world. And so in a way, it's like you're creating things that kind of erase man, it's like almost like a ruin. Like you're not going to maybe find anything there. It's a very quiet object. They have these mysterious openings. Even this Ken Price has an opening, so it could actually be functional, although was not meant to be functional. And actually, at this point, we have a quote from him saying, these are really like, I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says there, it's like a basis for color exploration, for abstraction and color. It's really about using the ceramic surface as a canvas. So in a way, it functions differently, like for Ken Price. And it's for him, it was about creating something that looked like so incredibly sort of perfect and regular that maybe it could have been made by a machine, but in fact, it was made through the skill of his own hands, having studied with Volkos and then moved in a more decorative direction with his works.
And when I saw this stuff in the show, which is all sort of in the same case, I just thought, if a writer pitched me on a story about these artists and sent these images, I'd think, I don't want to run that. I mean, it didn't do much for me. And we're going to talk about this here in a minute, but I think we all have sort of leanings, and to me, the life has been drained out of some of this stuff, and that hurts it as far as I'm concerned. But, other people can certainly appreciate this. And
yeah, it's kind of a formal exercise in a lot of ways.
Sure. Okay. Now we're going to move to a group of objects that seem uniquely modern, and maybe not everyone would mean that in a good way. What do you mean by the object as a means to an end?
Well, this is this sort of a couple of different categories. This sort of broke off from the Mark Lindquist category, where it's once removed, you're using machines to make something that is maybe considered to be handmade. And so we had this sort of collection of things that actually are not in the show, but are pieces that I've been observing and would have liked to include, but I didn't have examples of them or objects like them. The object as a means to an end, really, if you make something, but that isn't the final product, you use it in something in another way, and that becomes the artwork. In this particular case that you'll see is performance. So here we'll talk about these first. So if you may be familiar with Anthony Tomorrow's pieces that were published in American Craft Magazine, but he is somebody who's coming out of a metalwork and jewelry program, but has really made a name for himself with this 3D printing process, this laser sintering, to make end user objects. And, a lot of art programs use these now. MCAT has one, and they use it kind of for studies for sculpture and things like that. But for him, this becomes the object. So I would like, and in fact, when we open it up to questions, I'd be interested, because we're getting close to the end here, actually. I would be interested to know what the audience thinks. Is this more craft or is it more design? Because he's creating a computer program that he then programs to the printer. The printer communicates with the plastic material that's in the printer to layer and create these 3D objects. So, but he's coming from a more traditional craft background. So, but there are designers. Patrick Jouin has made furniture this way, and, very successfully. This is actually, I'm doing a lot of work with Finnish contemporary design and craft right now. And so these were like some pieces. I didn't see these actual pieces, but I saw some pieces by the same artist with the same process, where, again, this is a traditional craft artist, a jewelry artist with training in that area through one of the jewelry programs in Eastern Finland, who is making pieces that for him reference kind of old industrial detritus. But these are laser sintered plastic, and then they are patinated to look like they're old and rusted. And so, in this way, it's almost, again, it's sort of trompe l'oeil, but they're sort of unidentifiable. They're adornment, but he's making them with machine and other processes.
Okay, so this is from our magazine, obviously, before my time, 2009, but I know it well because to some degree I've had to live it down. People refer to this as the tongue issue. People will say, oh, you're doing so much better than when it was the Tongue magazine, that kind of thing. Some readers reacted to this story about Lauren Kallman, sort of the way David Ellsworth reacted to Mark Lindquist with his chainsaw and lathe. They saw this cover as kind of an obscene gesture. Tell us a little bit about Lauren Kallman and, the influence of performance art and what's going on here.
Well, and to Monica's defense, I put these in. I had used these in another lecture that I gave to kind of give a kind of a snapshot of craft and up to the present day. And it was at this point that the article was published. I found it very interesting because to me, it kind of stimulated discussion. It wasn't that I felt that this was something that I wanted for the collection, et cetera, but I thought the discussion was really interesting. I followed it with great interest in the magazine. But I saw her pieces at SOFA, and that same year, I think it was in 2010, maybe, when the pieces were really publicized and then shown. But the fact that she, as a jewelry artist, made these pieces for herself to wear, and then had herself photographed wearing them, and that became the artwork. So it wasn't that you could go and buy, the lip jewelry and wear it out at night. That wasn't the point. The point was that she made these things that became part of her performance, that were her art. Right. But she's coming from a jewelry background. She's a very skilled jewelry artist. So, once removed, okay, it's not really, what is the art and the craft as a means to an end in this particular case.
And we are a long way from Bob Stocksdale.
Yeah,
at this
we
point.
are.
So we did a story not too long ago in the magazine on artists who sort of focus on process over product. And the anecdote I remember from that is this guy who used to go to people's houses and wash their dishes and sign the sponge and leave that as his art form. And, this is one of those dividing lines between people. I think there are people who would say, oh, how interesting and imaginative. And there are other people who would say, good God, do something useful, right? So I don't know. That particular guy, the dishwasher, was an academic, okay? So he didn't have to do that to make a living. And this could be another whole evening's discussion, but making, needing to make a living, make an object that people can use, make a functional object, versus, making something for performance, it makes a huge difference,
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, and any artist in the audience could maybe speak to, there is often, a more of a production line, and this is the way a lot of the wood artists have, which is a field that I'm more closely related to, but having done so much work in that field recently. But also I found, even with the jewelry artists that I met when I was in Finland, is a lot of them were teaching, and then they were able to do their work, which, it's not the most expensive area of contemporary craft jewelry, art jewelry, but that was how they supplemented their income.
Okay, now we get to what I'm thinking of is sort of where craft meets art, which is when craft skills enable, as you say, a kind of personal expression. Tell us about this piece.
Well, Frankie Cummings is one of the wood artists. It's a little bit unusual in that he's African American, and he brings a lot of the kind of style and some of the traditions and visual aspects from African art into his work, and they become there's a real elegance to them. But this piece, this group of objects, to me, almost settled into something that was, they all became kind of talismanic in some way to the maker. So they were using their skill to create something that then would maybe give power to themselves in some way or to somebody else. And so that becomes kind of the subcategory of the subcategory, but or kind of a collectiveness to them. But this is, there's David Ellsworth again. You saw him in the slide, but that's him on the right and Frankie Cummings on the left. This came out of a project that Frankie Cummings, as a teacher, was proposing to a class about a magical event in your life, and how do you produce something that would maybe represent that or capture that in some way. And so he created this series that became sort of colloquially known as Magic Wands. And this is really a tribute to David Ellsworth, as Monica said, really is a spokesperson and a master and definer of that particular field. So almost as a kind of thank you to, for sharing his skill and bestowing it on the abilities on other people.
I love this piece. This is this ceramic piece that really kind of combines the form of the teapot and the iron. I frankly had never really thought about how those forms are so similar before I saw this, and there's actually another piece in the show that merges those two forms. when I looked at this, I thought about my mom and how when I was a little kid, she would spend like hours ironing my dad's shirts, and how, this is a really big piece and it's probably really heavy. And I thought, there were probably times when my mom wanted to do something much more violent with the with the iron. This is one of those things that to me has kind of animus. I mean, it has personality.
Mm-hmm. Some of you may know Susan. She's a local potter.
And of course, this is another local artist who we have shown in the magazine and had exhibited here in our space. I love this. Talk a little. This is a Shinto tradition that this comes out of.
Yeah, what Erica is doing with this piece is really, if you're familiar with her work, her garments have a lot of personal connections, and so this is a traditional Japanese form for this coat. But the idea is, and she is working with paper in this case, tea bags. Well, no, not in this. In this case, she's using envelopes and using tea as a dye. Sometimes she works with tea bags, but these little envelopes that each one has inside a message. It's meant to give power to the wearer. In this particular case, a family member who is suffering from cancer. So it's meant to be worn. Each of those messages is a plea for this person's recovery. So it is a talismanic object in that sense, and a lot of Erica's work has that quality. So she has such incredible skill with her materials, and she works with very unconventional materials. So, again, it's like the craftsmanship is excellent, but there's another higher meaning and higher function to this piece.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, finally, this is kind of a problematic ending, I would say. This is about what if somebody else actually ends up making your stuff, or your design is reproduced and that sort of thing.
Or you're making something in a series, which I don't have a picture of, but I guess the best example of this, and using, again, our collection, and this is a piece that doesn't get out enough, so I wanted to put it out. And it's a Picasso vase, but it illustrates how an artist who is familiar with reproductive techniques through printmaking used that idea and applied it to ceramics in working in the pottery, the Madura pottery, where he made these kind of prototypes that were cast, and the molds were used to make editions of his pieces that were stamped as Picasso editions. And so you actually have these ceramic editions. He was kind of I don't know, correct me somebody if I'm wrong, but he was sort of the first person to kind of think about this process that way. So in a way, it was almost like a print process. And it does become a little bit problematic because people think that Picasso's hand touched this when, in fact, it did not. So it is, I guess you could think of it as in a sense of once removed. There's also, and next to this piece is a set of 2 dishes that were made by an artist who worked as an industrial designer and made a cup that was produced in the millions. And so now he makes slip cast pieces and uses them in installations. And he made this series of 2 dishes that are in a presentation box as an addition. So it's an idea, it's that idea of additions, which we're more familiar with, I guess, through printmaking.
Now, it seems like in the art world, as opposed to the craft world, this idea that other people might make your stuff is a little less controversial. Would you say that's true? I
think so. Yes, I do. I think it's definitely less controversial, although there have now been books coming out on that subject.
Occasionally we get, angry, borderline angry notes from people saying design is not craft and that kind of stuff. So... and then tell us a little bit about these 2 pieces and how they fit into the show. Well,
it was like, I wanted to show these. I had these pieces out last year in a design show, but I wanted to show them from a more handmade aspect. So the Calder jewelry's at the top, and this is a Bertoia jewelry piece that was actually in Ralph Rapson's collection. And he, in this case, it illustrates 2 artists who were used to working with reproductive processes and making things in additions. Calder with prints, for example, and Bertoia with bronze cast sculpture, which was done in editions. But due to their different circumstances or the restrictions on materials during the war or their inherent need to do something with their hands, they made these little jewelry pieces that have now become an established part of their, work. And so Calder, as you may know, was very restless and always had wire with him and would, pinch it and crimp it and make it into jewelry that he would often give to his friends. And we have these pieces in the show. And then Bertoia, when he was at Cranbrook's teaching in the metalwork shop, he didn't have this bronze or, a lot of metal, just small amounts of metal. And so he made these lively, I think very lively jewelry pieces that are now prized because he didn't make them for very long, just a few years. So it's kind of the reverse. Sorry about the confusion, but it's kind of like the reverse of Picasso, where, these are actual handmade objects by artists who are used to working in editions.
Yeah. Okay. So as we've had all of our conversations, well, first of all, in the show, we've got ceramics, we've got wood, we've got a little metal. Here we're looking at it. We've got Erica's fiber work. There's no glass. Why is there no glass?
Why is there no glass? The reason is that our glass collection is really weak. So glass donors, no, we're working okay. with some glass donors, but it is a collection of ours that has come late in the game. Okay. So we don't have as much to choose from, and we have some strong pieces in our permanent gallery. And so my idea was not necessarily to denude that gallery for this exhibition. It was kind of to bring things up that maybe hadn't been appreciated so much. Okay. So that's why it wasn't like I have a bias against glass. I like glass, but
okay. So the final thing I want to mention is, as you and I have talked about all of these dimensions of craft, I have sort of wondered, and I have discussed this a little bit. Does everybody have like a craft preference profile? That you favor sort of functional or non-functional. You favor traditional or innovative. I mean, as an editorial team, occasionally we get story pitches from people. They'll say, oh, here's these traditional weavers and they've done the same thing for 30 years. And, we mostly look at each other and go, why would we run a story on them? They've done the same thing for 30 years. So we have sort of a bias toward innovative. But it seems to me that there is kind of a profile. So I was sort of profiling myself. I've got that. Maybe animate is not the right word. Maybe it should be animated. But, I've got that strong bias toward...
Cute?
Cute.
Is it cute? Does cute go there, or where does it go? I don't know.
Well, it's with the animated. I want my stuff to have a presence and a personality. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to be a white box. Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting, that you were... You like the functional, but yet you like the heart. But then the kind of heartfelt, that's sort of more, I don't know, is that the warm and fuzzy? Is that like warm and fuzzy? Yeah. Like a lot of the really, a lot of the sort of emerging artists that we see, especially coming out of, I hate to say it, MFA programs, do very cerebral work, and sometimes I'm like, oh, come on.
This needs an explanation.
Yeah,
for me to understand it.
So anyway, I was kind of wondering if you can tell us where you are.
I wasn't skilled enough to fill this in myself. And maybe I just didn't want to because, I'm here as a professional and not necessarily for my personal preference.
Yes,
but I mean, but that leads us to we had a discussion about this, and just as you as an editorial board have a certain preference, like the magazine has its own personality, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the things that you choose to include in it. Yep. And it's like if you put two curators in a room and gave them like a big collection, what they would choose to express a particular idea or a show would be completely different. And how we would develop our collections would be different. So it's like the Minneapolis Institute of Arts craft collection is going to look different from Philadelphia's or, LACMA's or whatever, depending upon what is appealing to the curators at that point in time. And then things change because we, acquired in the early 80s a number of ceramic sculpture pieces, like the Destabler that you saw in one of the photographs. We have a Viola Fry sculpture. We have a Richard Shaw, who's a Regis Master this year. That stuff was in the basement when I came. I mean, it was bought in the early 80s. I started working in the early 90s at the museum, and we just didn't quite know what to make of it. The curator was prescient enough to buy it at that time when the artists were he must have been advised well and kind of knew enough to buy, but they didn't really have a home in the museum for a long time. Now those artists, again, it's like the chainsaw. It's like Viola Fry, double grandmothers, of course, We did not know what to make of it when 20 years ago. It was like, Viola Fry, double grandmother, what is that? And so, the collecting areas change, the styles change, the artists change, the collections change, and for a long time we didn't add the work of living artists to our collection either, and now we do. So it's like the tide has completely shifted. But I guess to illustrate the fact that I love function, and I still like that to be a point of reference in some way. I don't know. I just think that if you're connected with craft, you have to be connected with function in some way. That's my feeling. But I am a decorative arts person, so it's the pots and pans that matter,